In MMA, there are many exciting, effective, and entertaining fighter archetypes. There's devastating kickboxers with one-punch power, submission specialists who can tap their opponent out from any angle, outfighting technicians who manage range with precise footwork and timing, and stocky wrestlers who swing big, meaty hooks. But then, there are fighter archetypes that just suck. Whether it's because their techniques don't work in modern MMA, or because it's just abysmally boring to watch, there are certain styles and archetypes of fighters that are simply horrible for the sport. So today, I'd like to go over the worst fighter archetypes in MMA by examining what makes them suck, bringing up a few examples to demonstrate my point, and then explaining how the archetype can be improved. So without further waiting, let's get started. The Jiu-jitsu butt scooter, or as I called it in my video from a year ago, the Jiu-jitsu power bottom, is one of the worst fighter archetypes in modern MMA from both an effectiveness and entertainment standpoint. Fighters from this archetype are all about fishing for submissions from bottom. You know, submissions like the arm bar, heel hook, and the triangle choke. In other words, their entire game plan for a fight revolves around getting a sweaty man on top of them and then trying to wrap their hairy legs around said sweaty man with the hopes of finishing them with the pressure of their crotch. While there aren't many well-known jiu-jitsu butt scooters in the UFC nowadays, a couple examples of this archetype from the history of the sport include the recently retired Paul Craig, Kron Gracie, Ryan Hall, Herbert Burns, and Claudio Puelles, who, as far as I'm aware, is the only jiu-jitsu butt scooter who is currently signed to the UFC. And well, at the highest levels of modern MMA, this fight style barely, if ever, works. And the main reason is pretty damn simple. The threat of heavy ground and pound keeps a lot of modern jiu-jitsu from working. If you've ever trained MMA before, you would know how much being hit with ground and pound sucks. Sure, most ground and pound you see in the UFC doesn't cause fighters to go unconscious, but when you're being hit on the side of the head with 4-ounce gloves, it can really mess with your ability to focus on anything besides getting out of that position. And if you're sitting in guard or going for an inside heel hook, you are in the perfect position to get punched or elbowed into oblivion. The best example of this happening is in Paul Craig's retirement fight with Modestas Bukauskas. In the fight, Paul Craig pulled guard with 30 seconds remaining in the first round, and got put out cold right as the buzzer sounded due to a power elbow from top. Another danger of this style is the threat of getting your head slammed against the canvas, as happened in Kron Gracie's fight against Bryce Mitchell. As you can see here, Kron was wrapping his legs around Bryce like he was trying to do some very unchristian things. So Bryce picked him up, framed his elbow against Kron's chin, and spiked his head into the canvas. However, the danger of being beaten up from top position or slammed on your head aren't the only downsides of this archetype. The style of the jiu-jitsu butt scooter is fundamentally reactive instead of proactive, as it requires the fighter on top to engage in the butt scooter's guard or leg entanglements to work. If the guy on top wants to disengage from the grappling, it is much easier to step out of the jiu-jitsu butt scooter's guard than it is to stand up from a position like bottom half guard or mount. And while some jiu-jitsu butt scooters like Claudio Puelles and Ryan Hall have tried to work their way around this problem with techniques like the Imanari roll, those techniques just aren't as effective or as reliable as the good old single leg or double leg takedown. Another problem that the jiu-jitsu butt scooter archetype has to contend with is, sweat. Yeah, I know that sounds gross, but as a fight goes on, fighters get sweaty and sometimes bloody as well. And the sweatier and bloodier you or your opponent are, the harder it is to catch them in a submission because they are far more likely to slip out. MMA isn't gi jiu-jitsu where you can just grab your opponent's lapel to drag them into your guard. However, all the downsides I've discussed so far have been about the jiu-jitsu butt scooter's grappling, which is supposed to be their strong point. Because on the feet, these guys are even worse. Now, first, the one good thing these guys tend to have on the feet is their kicking game. Ryan Hall's entire striking game was built around his kicks from range. Claudio Puelles had some nice kicks, and of course, Paul Craig had the infamous right body kick of doom. Jiu-jitsu butt scooters have very dexterous hips, which gives them the ability to flick out these great whipping kicks, especially to the body and the head. And if their opponent grabs the kick and takes them down, well, then they can start playing their guard game. However, that's the only good thing about their striking game, because the number one weakness of the Jiu-Jitsu power bottom is the complete and utter lack of any boxing, offensively or defensively whatsoever. Getting tuned up with boxing combinations is as common an occurrence for a Jiu-Jitsu power bottom as the MMA guru drinking mayonnaise straight from the tube. Paul Craig, Herbert Burns, and Claudio Puelles have all been tuned up on the feet by pretty run-of-the-mill boxing. Hell, Kron Gracie was getting beat up on the feet by Bryce Mitchell, who isn't that great of a striker himself. I don't know why this particular fighter archetype tends to have such bad hands, but it do be like that, man. It do be like that. They also tend not to be that durable, as can be seen from how brutal the KO losses the average Jiu-Jitsu butt scooter tends to suffer are. It's also worth noting that, since the first instinct of the Jiu-Jitsu butt scooter when they get hurt in a fight is to lay on their back, they can end up getting TKO'd because they refuse to stand up, as happened to Herbert Burns in his fight with Bill Algeo and Claudio Puelles in his fight with Dan Hooker. Now, as for how to improve this style, I have to say there are two main ways to make it better. The first is to make the grappling game more proactive, and the best example of this is Walter Walker. Walter Walker is currently on a 4-fight first-round heel hook win streak, and it's not because he's just laying guard waiting for shit to happen. As you can see here, Walker goes in for a takedown against Kennedy Nzechukwu and then attacks the heel hook. However, this is all happening at unranked heavyweight, so it is against the lowest level male competition in the UFC. Instead, the more optimal way to improve this style would be to develop, actual striking skills, as Charles Oliveira and Diego Lopez did. Both Charles and Diego come from a BJJ background, and they can hunt from submissions from bottom. However, they only really do that when the opportunity presents itself or when they're trying to use a submission to get up from bottom. Hunting for subs from bottom is their B game. Their A game is to maraud forward and take your head off. They employ their jiu-jitsu opportunistically like Diego Lopez did against John Silva, or through reliable takedowns, as Charles demonstrated in his fights with Michael Chandler and Mateusz Gamrot. But anyways, the jiu-jitsu butt scooter is not the kind of fighter you want to develop into. Fans don't like watching it most of the time, and you're going to do an any percent speed run of CTE by getting KO'd over and over and over again. The heavyweight blob is one of the most memed upon archetypes in modern MMA, and for good reason. Ever since the UFC started cracking down on PED users, the heavyweight division has steadily declined until we've gotten to the point where 40-year-old Derek Lewis could get himself another title shot if he beats Waldo Cortez Acosta. Heavyweight is just abysmal, and the fighter archetype of the heavyweight blob really illustrates this. Heavyweight blobs are defined by their complete and utter lack of any athleticism whatsoever, with slow, labored movements and a skill set that is often limited to throwing 1-2s at range and occasionally smudging their opponent into the cage and laying on them. Heavyweight blobs are called that because they have the exact opposite of an athletic physique, with some heavyweight blobs being literally morbidly obese. Examples of heavyweight blobs include Chris Barnett, Hamdi Abdelwahab, Thomas Peterson, the Tafa brothers, Tai Tuivasa, and of course, we can't forget the GOAT, Shamil, the meal deal Gaziev. Now, don't get me wrong, some of these heavyweight blobs can be pretty fun to watch. I mean, I was laughing hysterically while watching Hamdi versus Chris Barnett, and I do think that Shamil is a pretty funny guy outside the octagon. But man, unless heavyweight blobs get a quick KO or end up having a hilariously awful fight, their matches can be worse than unranked women's MMA. And that is saying something. However, the fact that you can be a heavyweight blob and be successful in the UFC is a condemnation of the entire heavyweight division in general. Currently, I would classify 3 of the top 15 UFC heavyweights as heavyweight blobs, and honestly, You might even be able to expand that definition if you count 40-year-old Derrick Lewis and his Popeye's chicken-fueled body as one. And the thing with heavyweight blobs is that the blobs are actually quite successful despite being incredibly unathletic and unskilled, which is due to a combination of the two attributes that the best of the blobs have, which are KO power and durability. I mean, Tai Tuivasa nearly got a title shot off of just these two attributes, since he nearly chinned Cyril Gane. However, when you put a heavyweight blob up against a seriously well-trained striker, they actually just end up getting pieced up, as you can see from the sparring footage between Tai and Alex Pereira. Alex isn't going hard by any means, but the difference in skill level is evident. However, being tough doesn't stop these heavyweight blobs from getting finished, as we've seen with the rampage that Jailton Almeida and Walter Walker have gone on in the division. Prior to becoming known as the most pacifist man in MMA during his cuddlefest with Alexander Volkov, where he landed 9 significant strikes over the course of 15 minutes, Jailton Almeida was known by another name, the Fat Man Strangler. And that's because Jailton Almeida would get matched up with a heavyweight blob, throw a front kick at the opening of the fight, and then shoot a takedown and submit them with a rear naked choke in the first round. The same goes for Walter Walker, but with heel hooks instead. Heavyweight blobs have negative takedown defense and submission defense, and they end up getting completely destroyed as they face anyone with even a modicum of wrestling experience. Now, how does one fix the heavyweight blob? Well, if you take blasting gear off the table, then the second best option is to get the blobs on the treadmill. The best example of this is Steven Asplund, who made his UFC debut on the final card of 2025. In his fight, Asplund showed remarkable grit and cardio for a heavyweight blob, eventually getting a TKO win in the second round. For this fight, he and his opponent received the Fight of the Night bonus, an award that hadn't been given out to a heavyweight fight for 3 years. Yes, the heavyweight division has been so bad that they haven't given out a Fight of the Night since Tai Tuivasa versus Cyril Gane. And the reason why Asplund was able to put on this performance was because of his cardio. Even though Steven Asplund is the blobbiest of heavyweight blobs by appearance, he is a spiritual middleweight. He throws a lot of volume, he's very light on his feet, and honestly, I think he's going to be ranked soon. So yeah, while blobs might be ruining heavyweight, there's some hope that a new breed of blob, the cardio blob, might make things great again. The staller is a universally despised archetype in MMA. Athletes from this archetype are all about laying on top of their opponent or shoving them up against the cage and just not doing anything. The staller is dreadfully boring to watch, as their game plan is to hug their opponent for 15 minutes straight while doing a little damage and going for 0 submissions. It's all just control from guard, half guard, or the body lock up against the fence while throwing knees to the thigh. Examples of notorious stallers in MMA include Torres Finney, Movsar Evloev, and John Fitch. Most fighters of this archetype come from a wrestling or jiu-jitsu background and are actually pretty good at getting wins. However, because of just how little finishing ability they have, and how dull they are to watch, they end up getting denied title opportunities. The best example of this is John Fitch, who had to go on an 8-fight win streak in the UFC to get a title shot against Georges St-Pierre, and then after losing to GSP, went on another 5-fight win streak without getting another shot. And this is because Fitch would just take his opponents down and lay on them. The other example, of course, is Movsar Evloev, who is 19-0, undefeated, and on a 9-fight win streak in the UFC, but hasn't even gotten a title eliminator yet because he has yet to get a single finish in the promotion. The staller style is very effective at getting a fighter the win, but it is pure poison for your overall MMA career because you will be denied opportunities in favor of more entertaining fighters. It is also worth noting that certain fighters end up becoming stallers when they want to play it safe against higher levels of competition, with examples including Islam Makhachev versus Jack Della Maddalena, Khamzat Chimaev versus Dricus du Plessis, Merab Dvalishvili versus Jose Aldo, and Jailton Almeida versus any remotely athletic non-blob heavyweight. In women's MMA, the current Valentina Shevchenko would also fall into this archetype of fighter. And the problem for MMA is that the staller is an extremely effective archetype for winning, as it is one of the most risk-free ways to win a fight. But it is also the worst archetype for the fans and MMA promoters. So, how does one stop the staller from stalling? Or, on the other hand, make the staller more exciting? First, if you're a staller and have a problem with finishing opponents, prioritize ground and pound over control. Sure, if you throw ground and pound strikes, you do risk losing position, but if you hurt your opponent with the strikes, it will actually make them easier to control. One of the most underrated ground strikes is knees to the body from side control. As you can see here, Merab hurts O'Malley quite a bit with his knee. And don't forget how GSP beat up Matt Serra with these strikes too. So yeah, the staller is dull to watch. And while it is definitely an effective fighter archetype at getting the win, they are going to be kept out of title contention for as long as possible, and for good reason as well. Hence, their placement on this list. Getting back to another fighter archetype that just sucks all around, let's talk about the anorexic range merchant. You know who they are. The guys who are long, lanky, and built like a string bean who try to make a career out of fighting men half their height. In the case of the anorexic range merchant, I'm mainly talking about fighters competing at featherweight and below. And to give you a few examples, there's Sean Woodson, who is 6'2" or 188 centimeters at featherweight, Jose Johnson, who is 6 feet or 182 centimeters at flyweight, and I would also border on classifying Giga Chikadze, who is 6 feet even at featherweight in this category, as well as Corey Sandhagen and Sean O'Malley, who are both 5'11" at bantamweight, albeit those three guys aren't as egregious as Woodson or Johnson. Anorexic range merchants are exactly what the name implies. Skinny guys who fight at the lower weight classes by outpointing their opponents at range. Anorexic range merchants typically build their game around straight punches and kicks while desperately trying to prevent getting taken down or caught in an exchange in the pocket. Also, despite exclusively being strikers, anorexic range merchants tend to be rather pillow-fisted. Now, you may think at first that being an incredibly tall and rangy guy for a division could be a fighter archetype that could work pretty damn well. And it actually kind of can, but only against lower levels of competition. And let me explain why. At the lower levels of the sport, most fighters don't know how to pressure effectively and cut off the cage. However, once you get up to the higher levels of competition, this becomes an increasingly common skill. Cage cutting is an anorexic range merchant's kryptonite, as it exposes them to their two biggest weaknesses, which are takedowns and trading punches in the pocket. When a shorter, stockier fighter gets a range merchant up to the cage, they have the option to go straight for their hips, which are easier to get a hold of because they're naturally higher up, or just swing shots at them. And you can see this pattern happening over and over again. In Jose Johnson's fight against the 5'4" Asu Almabayev, he got pushed up to the fence and completely dominated in the wrestling department. In Sean Woodson's fight against the 5'6" Dan Ige, he got pressured up to the cage in the third round and TKO'd. The same goes for Giga Chikadze's fight against the 5'7" Kevin Vallejos, who pressured him up to the cage and knocked him out with punches and a spinning back fist. In striking-only combat sports like boxing, kickboxing, and Muay Thai, the advantages of being a tall and long guy are much more pronounced because of the lack of a wrestling threat. But as soon as wrestling is introduced into the equation, these guys end up getting torn apart. Another big reason why the anorexic range merchant struggles in the UFC is the cage itself. When fighting in the ring, a taller fighter has the option of leaning back to avoid punches. You know, tall man's defense. But they can't do that in the cage, and as a result, they just end up getting chinned. And if you want proof that this archetype of fighter kinda just sucks, just look at the champions at flyweight, bantamweight, and featherweight. They're all in the 5'3" to 5'7" range. And even up at lightweight, both Ilya and Arman are 5'7". And even the most successful range merchant, Sean O'Malley, got dominated by the 5-foot wrestle boxer in Merab twice. So, how do you improve fighters from this archetype? It's pretty simple. Put on some actual muscle and move up a weight class. They'll still be tall for the higher weight class, but will have much better takedown defense and stopping power. And it's because it all comes down to this. In MMA, it is much better, much better to have the ability to wrestle and impose your grappling than it is to poke at your opponent from range. The WMMA Air Puncher is an archetype in women's MMA that applies to basically about half the women's MMA roster. To put it bluntly, many of the female fighters in the UFC don't actually strike. They just shadow box outside of kicking range with their eyes closed. There are no attempts to set anything up, and there are no attempts to deal damage. They just like to roleplay like it's 2020 with their social distancing. And the result is a miserable experience for the audience, and honestly, it's one of the few things in MMA that is worse to watch than stalling in guard or clinching up against the fence. Now, the WMMA Air Puncher isn't so much an archetype as it is a phenomenon that can beset any female fighter not named Zhang Weili at any time. And there's plenty of examples of this happening. You know, Raquel Pennington versus Maria Bueno Silva, Pooja Tomar versus Ryan Dos Santos. You know, even Kayla Harrison showed signs of this problem in her fight against Ketlin Vieira. The worst and most prominent example of this is, of course, Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza 2, where they landed a combined total of 67 strikes over 25 minutes. Now, the solution to fixing this is, I don't know. I seriously don't know, because it is not a problem of technique, but rather of willpower. You need guts to trade strikes, and while some WMMA fighters like Zhang Weili, Amanda Nunes, Chris Cyborg, and Prime Rose Namajunas do show plenty of that, others just don't have that. So yeah, I don't have much else to say besides that this archetype sucks, and it's poison for the sport. And at last, we get to what I consider to be the worst archetype for MMA, which are the chinless ones. Now, this is just my humble opinion, but after years of watching the sport, I think the attribute that any successful fighter must have is a good chin. Not an iron chin, not even a great chin, just a good one, a serviceable one. Even guys with mediocre chins like Charles Oliveira can make it very, very far in MMA. But not guys who are just chinless. And that is because when a fight takes place in 4-ounce gloves, you will get KO'd if you have a bad chin. Examples of chinless fighters include Cody Garbrandt, James Vick, Johnny Walker, Matt Schnell, Grant Dawson, and of course, the man in the thumbnail, Anshul Jubilee. And there are two reasons why being chinless is so bad for MMA. First, it is the one thing you really cannot fix or improve in MMA. If you lack physical strength, you can always just lift weights. If you lack punching power, you can work on your punching technique. If you lack cardio, you can do more road work. And of course, you can just take PEDs to improve all of the above. You know, just ask the PFL featherweight champion, Mavlid Khaybuliev, a member of Khabib's team who suddenly developed 5-round cardio by injecting EPO. But there is no fixing a bad chin, not even with drugs. It's not like you can inject a serum and make it so that your brain doesn't switch off when your head gets spun around with a punch. Second, having a bad chin means that no matter what game plan you have for a fight, you have to implement it with absolute perfection. Because if you get caught with anything, you're going to sleep. A great example of this is Grant Dawson. Dawson is a fantastic grappler and wrestler, with some top control that is genuinely on par with some top-level guys in the division like Arman Tsarukyan and Charles Oliveira. But the problem is that he needs to get a hold of his opponent and take them down immediately, or else he just gets KO'd, as we saw in his fights with Bobby Green and Manuel Torres. The same applies to Anshul Jubilee, who was piecing up Mike Breeden, a guy who was 0-3 in the UFC, for 3 rounds with clean jabs and straight right hands. And Jubilee was fighting well on the outside until Mike landed that one clean right hand that put Jubilee to sleep. Being one of the Chinless in MMA is like doing a no-hit speedrun of the entire Soulsborne franchise in a single sitting. Your opposition can screw up, but you have to be perfect. And the solution to being Chinless is, well, just retire, man. Do grappling instead and your brain will thank you. But yeah, that's the entire video. Hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.